At the time I was 3 years old. My parents and I lived in the town of Wolomin, which is about 14 miles east of Warsaw. My parents had a bicycle shop and led the normal middle class life. They didn't aspire to become millionaires. They didn't aspire to be famous. They just wanted to live with no fear of being hungry or anything terrible happening. It took the Germans 3 weeks to conquer Poland, and as soon as the soldiers arrived in Wolomin, they herded all the Jews into a ghetto which had been summer houses. They surrounded it with barbed wire. My grandma Rachel, my father's mom, who was living with us at the time, decided that she didn't want to go to the ghetto, and instead she went back to her home in Pristine and unfortunately died in Treblinka, which ironically was built on my grandfather's farm. Once we were in the ghetto, and part of the reason why I'm not sure that let me stop here for a second. Once we're in the ghetto, I don't know why I'm having trouble. Normally you don't have trouble with that. I don't feel completely comfortable thinking of myself as a survivor. I survived thanks to my mother, not through anything I did. I was a child, and like most children, what happened to me happened because of my parents. When we're in the ghetto, there was always a shortage of food. The Germans allowed a certain amount of food, but it was never sufficient. And so a number of people took the risk of climbing under the barbed wire, going out and buying food from farmers and smuggling it in. My mother was the only woman in that group. All the others were men. Part of it was because she was bored with nothing to do. She didn't have a store to run. Part of it was because my mother always wanted to prove how smart and capable and clever she was. It is those things that helped her survive while many of the smugglers got caught, and when they got caught, they got shot. My mother always survived by using her cunning and willingness to lie when necessary, to make up a story and to get back safe and sound. While we were in the ghetto, the railroad tracks ran next to the ghetto, and we could see the carol cars filled with Jews from the Warsaw ghetto on the way to Treblinka. Treblinka is not as famous as Auschwitz because there aren't any survivors from it. It was not a work camp, it was a death camp where people were brought in and just gassed. Everybody in the ghetto knew that bad things were going to happen. But my mother was one of the few who saw us as being in a holding pen, like cattle ready to be slaughtered. So on her sorties to get food, she started checking out various farmers to see if any of them would be willing to hire us out for a price. And eventually she found one that was both willing and she felt she could trust. I remember it being 2 o'clock in the morning or so, being awakened by my parents. They had one valise and they said, "Get dressed, we're leaving." We climbed under the wires, walked the 6 miles to the farm, and then spent the next 3 years in a root cellar, sleeping on burlap bags filled with straw, surviving on potatoes and bread and and bread, and those two are still my comfort foods, even though I could have a lot better once we came to the United States. The thing that kept me going was my parents taught me how to read, and my mother would occasionally smuggle in a book for me. And those books broke down the walls of the cellar. They allowed me to wander in imaginary worlds where there were no restraints, where I could do whatever I wanted. Now, this served me in later life. People think of a scientist as being very logical, but the difference between scientists is, can you imagine the impossible? My favorite writing that I had on my desk was a statement by the famous French mathematician Pascal, who said, once you take the impossible into your calculations, the possibilities become limitless. And it has served me through life. The farmers kept us there for about 3 years. When the war was getting closer to an end, they said, it's becoming too dangerous, and so they say you have to leave. My mother asked them to give her 48 hours to find another place. Germans had patrols for the next few days because the Polish resistance had bombed one of their barracks, and so they were really clamping down, and my mother couldn't come back. So my father and I wandered through the fields, and we ran into an old farmer who had been a client of my father's. He was a widower, and he agreed to hide us on his farm. And here we hid in a back bedroom and stayed there for a couple of months. One Sunday, while we're sitting there, we saw 2 carloads of German soldiers arrived in front of the farm, and we thought we were dead. We heard the heavy boots of the soldier marching through the kitchen, the living room, coming to the door, and we saw the door handle turn. Just as the doorknob was all the way to the right, there was a call from outside, and we saw the door handle, like in a movie shot, turn back, and the German walk away. We heard his steps moving away. And what saved us by a second was that the Germans weren't there looking for Jews. They were looking for an illegal vodka still that the farmer's son had. And they found it still in the barn a second before the door to our bedroom closed. After that, my father decided that maybe it was time to find my mother. She was really the engine that ran the family, which is why I called my book My Mother's War. And the place where he was pretty sure he could get at least a contact was this Polish family who my mother had conned into believing that as all Jews were immensely rich, they didn't want to keep us themselves, but they had an uncle and aunt 60 miles away who were old, wanted to stay on their farm, but didn't have the energy to keep it going. So those people agreed to keep my mother, and she, being young and strong, became indispensable to them. She said, you have to bring my husband and child also, or I'm going to have to leave. Mrs. Chepilovich came down and took the 2 of us, and we walked to the train station 3 miles away from Volomin because people would have recognized my father. She put a hat over my head and told everybody on the train that I was suffering from tuberculosis. And my dad looked Polish enough. He was blonde and blue-eyed, and he had grown a long walrus mustache, but he spoke Polish with a Yiddish accent. So she told him that he had been shell-shocked during the war, and so he was an idiot, and he was mute. And this is how we got to the farm. But I'll never forget the thrill of seeing my mother and being able to hug her again. It's the first time also that we had a real full meal. It may not seem too much to us in the United States, but bacon and eggs and a glass of milk seemed like the most expensive upscale restaurant you can get. And I remember that night lying in bed with freshly pressed sheets, and the windows were open, and I could smell pines which surrounded the house. And to this day, the scent of pine is my favorite scent. We spent the rest of the war on that farm, but during that time there was one incident that really stands out, which is bizarre. Towards the end of the war, as the German army was retreating, battalion bivouacked on the farm, and one of them fell madly in love with my mother. He wanted her to go to Germany to wait out the end of the war and wait for him until he came back. My mother was supposedly a war widow. Her husband had been killed in the war, and I was a child. My father was still the idiot cousin who sat in a room and didn't speak to anybody. The German officer wanted my mother to take romantic walks with him, and my father having to sit in the room knowing that his wife was taking a walk in the moonlight with a German officer. This leaves a mark on your soul. And my mother had to play a very careful game of admitting to the German officer that she found him attractive, but she was still mourning her husband, and she wasn't ready to give her heart to him, but maybe in time. In my fantasies, I killed him. He came back one day, and his uniform was bloodied, and he was in a terrible mood. He and some soldiers had found some Jews hiding in the forest and had killed him, and his uniform gets spattered with blood, and he was furious, and my mother calmed him down by saying, "Don't worry, I can get the stains out of the uniform." We passed as Catholics, and the German, of course, thought of us as Christian. He may have been taken with my mother, but had he known she was Jewish, he would have probably killed her just as much as the Jews he had found in the forest. The war kept coming closer and closer to the end, and our farm, which was fairly isolated, was in no man's territory between the Russian and the German armies. And so my father and the farmer dug a bunker where we hid out as the bullets were flying all around us. And we were in that bunker for about 3 days, and one night in the middle of the night, the dogs started barking. And suddenly men with guns yelling in Russian told us to come out with our hands up. Like most great moments that happen in your life that you expect are going to be momentous, this was just one of these quiet things, like a whisper. Suddenly, we didn't have to worry about the Germans. We were free. Once we found out that Volhynian was liberated, my parents decided to leave the Russian army encampment and walk back towards Volhynian. When we got back to Volhynian, people weren't thrilled to see us. We were the only Jewish family that had come back to town. I don't know if others had survived, but at the time we were the only ones. People who had taken over our store and our house, and we were seen as, see how the Jews are? They always screw you in the end. They came back as forgetting that this was our own property. My education in Volhynian lasted half a day. The kids beat me up at lunchtime and I came home. I fought back. I was very angry at Jews for letting ourselves be slaughtered. We knew we were going to die anyway. Why didn't we fight back? And only at the end, in Warsaw, when everybody knew there was no hope, did you get resistance. The people in town tried to organize a pogrom to kill us. And what saved us was that the commander of the Russian forces in town was Jewish, and so he put a guard on our door, but we knew we couldn't stay. And so we moved on to Warsaw. And my parents had to try to reclaim, rebuild their lives, starting with nothing. And with the kind of guilt that survivors often have. My grandfather, my mother's father, was living with us in the ghetto. He had been caught by the Germans and beaten up and tied to a tree for 3 days in the middle of Polish winter, which is Minnesota-like winter. So he was paralyzed from the waist down. And when my mother decided to leave the ghetto, escape the ghetto, and go hide on the farm, she had to be faced with the thing that she couldn't take her father with her because he was paralyzed and he couldn't have made it there. It's still a horrible decision to have to make, to abandon your father to a certain death. Our time in Paris, my mother continued various semi-legal activities. And she also ran a handbag factory out of our apartment in Paris, which was in a hooker hotel. But eventually, after 6 long years, we got a visa to the United States. Our time in Paris was very important to me. Paris is a place where I acquired my values and my ideas about what I ought to strive for. I didn't get a chance to go to school till I was 11 years old. After 1 year in elementary school, I passed the exam to get into the Collège Turgot. And I loved that place because it was very freewheeling and I was being taught according to the concepts of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I was in a special class. But my parents were worried that it was a little too loose. They wanted me to, like all Jewish parents, they wanted me to become a doctor. And they thought I would be better off going to a more classical lycée. And so I left my happy place at the Collège Turgot and went to Lycée Charlemagne, which is one of the 4 grand lycées in Paris. I was the only Jew. I was the only blue-collar kid. And I didn't fit in. Despite the anti-Semitism and being sort of an outcast, I got a wonderful education in spite of all my efforts to rebel. The French educational system is, because it is based on meritocracy, you don't have to be babied. You can learn far more than we Americans assume. The American high school recognized that I knew more than was on my transcript, and they just let me take Regents exams for any subject I thought I could pass. And so I was able to graduate from high school in 2 years, and I entered CCNY at the age of 16 and a half. And eventually went to graduate school at NYU, where I got a PhD. I took a job in industry. What I thought would be a year turned out to be most of my career at DuPont. I got projects which gave me a chance to use my imagination, and while I was at DuPont, I got 79 patents, and together with my stay at Penn for a few years after I retired from DuPont, I had something like 120 articles in referee journals. Throughout, even when I was working at DuPont, I found people more interesting than molecules. And so, while continuing to work there, I went and got a second doctorate in social psychology and left DuPont for a while to teach organizational behavior at Rutgers School of Business. The reason I give talks, even though it brings me back to a past I really don't want to remember, is because the Holocaust, or genocide in general, is not just a Jewish problem. It's a human problem. You may wonder, how could Germany, which produced so many wonderful musicians and philosophers and writers, and was the basis of good part of Western culture, commit such atrocities? When I think about it, it happens because they define Jews as the other. And once you define somebody as the other and as either malevolent or less than human, then it makes it legitimate to commit all sorts of atrocities against them. My flesh and blood legacy are my children. But I want my legacy to help people understand that real civilization is not just producing art and music and science and literature. It is producing a society where people are treated equally, immaterial of their religion, their color, but they're accepted as human beings. It's a lofty goal, and if I'm lucky, I will be one small brick into the monument to kindness in this world.